Last night the government was forced to withdraw its programme motion from the House of Lords Reform Bill in the face of massive opposition from its backbenchers. More than 90 Conservative backbenchers voted against the second reading of the bill, and the government is now forced to reconsider its actions before the autumn. But what are the options in reality? Where can the government go from here on Lords Reform?
Well, the government is undoubtedly in a very difficult spot. I think there are basically 4 things that it could try and do, not all of which are feasible. One is it could take the summer trying to persuade its backbenchers to support this bill and have another go at getting the programme motion through in the autumn. There have been suggestions that Cameron is going to be working on his backbenchers over the summer. But in honesty, I think they are so implacably opposed to this bill that however much time they've got, they're not going to come round. He could try and persuade them by making very big concessions, and one of those concessions would be a referendum on the proposals. But of course, Nick Clegg really doesn't want that. And the concern would be that if this package was put to the country in a referendum, it might not be supported. So that would be a very big risk for the government. The other thing they could try and do, because Labour has said that it supports the bill in principle, is get it through with Labour support, come to some kind of deal with Labour to support the bill to get it through. But that is, although the numbers might look like they add up, because Labour supported the second reading, that would be very, very risky. Firstly, there's no way that they can really rely on Labour in the way that they could rely on their own people. Labour doesn't in the end have an interest in keeping this government going, so although they might like the idea of the reform, they could pull the plug at any time. That would be very risky. They'd also have to give a referendum if they were relying on Labour support, because that's a key Labour demand, so again it could go down in the country. But crucially, even if Labour could be relied on to support the government to get the bill through, Cameron would then be putting a bill through with Labour support against the wishes of his own backbenchers, which would put him in a politically impossible position. It would be too uncomfortable. I just don't think it would be feasible. So blaming it on Labour or looking to Labour to get them out of the mess, I don't think is going to work. Basically, therefore, I think these reforms are dead. So they've got to look to other solutions. One thing is simply give up on Lords Reform, do nothing. That would be a shame, because virtually everybody agrees that the Lords needs reforming in some way, and so some reform is essential. So the last option then is an alternative package of reform, something that can get wider support, something not as radical as what Nick Clegg was proposing. And that is maybe what the government ought to be thinking about over the summer.
Do you think such a package can be found?
It's difficult, I think, but not impossible, and it's certainly got more hope than the package that the government was trying to get through yesterday. One thing that they could do is try and come up with some sort of watered down version of the elected option. So maybe a chamber in which only a minority were elected, at least in the first instance. Some have suggested that this could be a compromise. It would be a compromise in a sense, but the problem is that a lot of the opponents of reform are fundamentally opposed to having elected members. You'd have to have a bill, even to have a minority elected element, and as soon as you've got a bill, you're facing a lot of the same problems that they were on this, such as what are the boundaries going to be, what's the electoral system going to be, what terms of office, renewable or non-renewable, and there was a lot of discontent on both the Labour and the Conservative benches on those issues. So I'm not sure that anything with an elected element is really going to have a good chance of getting through. The alternative would be to try and do something to radically reform the appointments process. Something a bit more incremental that we could build onto the House of Lords we've got now, perhaps even without legislation. So one of the most problematic features of the House of Lords as it is now is the extent of prime ministerial patronage. The Prime Minister can decide how many appointments are made, when they're made, what the balance is between the parties, with no formal control on those powers. One thing that the Liberal Democrats want to get out of reform is proportionality. A sort of proportional representation system built into the second chamber. So David Cameron could, for example, come out and pledge and even hand over power to the House of Lords Appointments Commission to ensure that this happens, that appointments in the future will be made on a proportional basis. The Appointments Commission could be asked to invite nominations from the parties in line with last general election vote shares every time the size of the chamber dips down below a certain size, for example. That seems like an incremental reform, but it would be pretty radical, and it would be a big win for Clegg, I think, and a big win for Cameron as well. It would be something they'd both be remembered for. To go beyond that, you would need legislation. So to do things like forcibly shrinking the size of the chamber, getting rid of the hereditary peers, these kinds of things would need a bill. Some people are suggesting there should be a bill along those lines. It might achieve better support than the package which they put before the House of Commons in the last few days. It would still get a bit of a rocky ride, because of course some people would complain that why aren't they proposing election, because they want election. So it's difficult for the government to win, but I think it might have a better chance of getting that through than the largely elected option.
You mentioned some of the things in the bill which were very controversial, particularly the 15-year non-renewable terms for elected members. Were MPs right to raise concern about this? If there are elected members, should this be changed?
No, I don't think that MPs were right to complain about those things, actually. I think there were very good reasons to put long non-renewable terms into the bill. I think the government was doing the right thing there. Some of the things that concern people about introducing an elected second chamber in replacement of the Lords are things like the fact that an elected chamber would be more partisan than the current House of Lords, that elected senators might compete with MPs on their home turf over constituency work, that the elected chamber would be seen as much more legitimate than now and perhaps even challenge the legitimacy of the House of Commons. But those are precisely the reasons why the long non-renewable terms are put in, to encourage independence, to discourage constituency work, to make it clear that it's not as legitimate as the House of Commons. If you look around the world at other second chambers, it's very common for there to be provisions such as these in other places around the world. And actually these proposals have been around for a long time. The Royal Commission proposed this kind of arrangement, and actually the last Labour government proposed this kind of arrangement in Jack Straw's White Paper back a few years ago. So it's quite disappointing to hear the Labour front bench criticising them now. I think there are very good reasons for them to be in the bill.
All in all, it seems that Lords reform is very difficult to achieve, and whatever the government proposes, somebody's going to object.
Yes, that's right. We've seen numerous proposals over the last 15 years. The Royal Commission in 2000 proposed a minority elected chamber. That was rubbished for not being democratic enough. We then saw votes in the House of Commons on a whole range of options in 2003 for how many elected and appointed members there should be, and the House of Commons rejected everything, including a majority elected chamber. Jack Straw had a go at proposing 50-50 elected appointed. That was rejected as well. And now we're on to majority election, and it seems that Conservative backbenchers and quite a number of people on the Labour benches as well don't want that. So we've been full circle. We've seen all of the options. Whatever it is the government puts in terms of composition, MPs don't like it. And now that we've got to talking about largely elected as the serious option, people are beginning to worry about the effect that that would have on the relationship between the two chambers, whether the House of Lords would challenge the House of Commons and become too confident and too assertive. But these are fundamental conundrums which face people thinking about second chamber design all over the world. There are basic conundrums about bicameralism. Second chambers exist to challenge the decisions of elected first chambers. Whether they are elected or appointed, whatever powers they have, they are always controversial institutions. We see this all over the world, including where they have elected chambers. So for that reason, second chambers are extremely difficult to reform. Governments often want them to be weaker, oppositions want them to be stronger, the public want them to be stronger, but that's very difficult for governments. So we've seen over the last 100 years of history of House of Lords reform how difficult it is to achieve reform. We've never had a big package of reform like the one that the government has proposed go through. The only things that have succeeded are small incremental reforms, and frankly I think this government, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, will be doing very well if they can just make that next stage of incremental reform. They'll go down in history for it.